everyone, and welcome to our podcast series on synthetic biology.
We're the City of London iGEM team of 2024, and our goal is to release weekly podcasts you can listen to anywhere at any time.
Our first episode today is about eukaryotic cells and the organelles within them. So without further ado, let's dive right in.
Let's start off by looking at the basic unit of life, the cell.
Wait, but what's a cell?
I'm pretty sure the cell is the smallest biological structure that can replicate independently and fulfills all the functions of life.
This is very Mrs. Gren, and that, for anyone who doesn't know, stands for movement, reproduction, sensitivity, growth, respiration, excretion, and nutrition. And that's basically a checklist. If you fulfill all those, you are a living organism.
There are two main types of cell, eukaryotic and prokaryotic. Eukaryotic cells, such as the cells in the human body, contain a nucleus surrounded by a membrane, as well as many other cell structures fulfilling a specific function called organelles.
Prokaryotic cells, meanwhile, are things such as bacteria, and they do not store the genetic material inside a nucleus. Instead, the genetic material is free-floating in loops inside the cell and are not contained in a membrane. But we'll learn more about these in episode 2.
So explain to the people who don't know what a nucleus is.
It's basically a place in the cell that contains the genetic information of the cell. That's what makes it so important. It basically controls the whole cell. This genetic information in the nucleus is stored as chromatin, which is just a fancy word for saying that it's stored as a combination of DNA and histones. And these histones are just special proteins that help to form chromosomes.
So, do all these organelles sit in empty space?
Oh, definitely not. Cytoplasm is the main component of every cell, in which all the cell organelles flow. It's like a fluid inside the cell where many cell reactions take place, including protein synthesis, which happens in free-floating ribosomes.
So, what are ribosomes exactly? Care to give us some more information?
Yes, sure. They're basically little machines that convert genetic material in the form of mRNA into proteins via translation.
Right, and where are they found?
These ribosomes are found on the surface of the rough endoplasmic reticulum, or they're free-floating in the cell, and the fact that they're on the endoplasmic reticulum is what makes it rough.
So here's an extra fun fact. The ribosomes are actually formed from ribosomal RNA, which is produced inside the nucleus, which is like a dense little region inside the nucleus, like a mini nucleus.
When we were discussing ribosomes, we mentioned the rough endoplasmic reticulum, or ER. This is a structure made out of long tubes connected to the surface of the nucleus. The rough endoplasmic reticulum, as well as being the site of protein synthesis, modifies and transports these proteins by adding new prosthetic groups, which are non-proteins that are attached to the newly made protein. For example, they might add carbohydrates to form glycoproteins and then ship those to various parts of the cell, including the Golgi apparatus.
Another example is adding an iron group to hemoglobin, and hemoglobin basically transports oxygen all around our body. So that's another fun fact. But, this is quite a lot, so before everyone panics, we will get to all of this in another video. But aside from that, we have to talk about the sister of the endoplasmic reticulum, which is the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. And that looks pretty much the same, but without the ribosomes on top of it. This is where all sorts of lipids and hormones get made.
At this point, you're probably wondering what lipids, proteins, and carbohydrates and nucleic acids actually are. We talked about them a lot, but we haven't really explained. They're basically the 4 macromolecules of life. Everything, essentially, in the body is built from these 4 different types of substances, and they compose all the organelles and cell structures that we talked about, and they each have really unique functions and properties.
For example, the cell membrane is made up of a type of lipid called a phospholipid, which is, as you can quite literally tell, a lipid with a phosphate group added on it. But the ribosome is made of protein and nucleic acids, which we touched on before.
We also mentioned the Golgi when we took a look at the ER. Let's talk about that in some more detail.
The Golgi and ER actually have a very similar structure, which is good for us. They're folded, consisting of flattened membrane-bound sacs. But unlike the ER, the Golgi apparatus modifies and practices the proteins for transport in vesicles.
So what are vesicles then?
Vesicles are membrane-bound spheres used for transport and storage of molecules that don't freely diffuse around a cell. Vesicles move around the cell, and you might be wondering, how could they move on their own? But the cytoskeleton, which is another organelle within our cells, helps guide these vesicles around the cell, and it does this through long tubes of protein called microtubules.
So lysosomes are a type of vesicle. That makes sense.
Exactly, yep.
So microtubules also come in really handy when we're talking about mitosis and cell division. This whole cytoskeleton apparatus is really useful, and these spindle fibers pull the cell apart and help the cell to divide.
Some eukaryotic cells have a special type of vesicle called a lysosome. They are little vesicles filled with hydrolytic enzymes which can destroy the cell if the cell is being bad or has gone rogue. The vesicles will release the enzymes into the cell and destroy it. If you're interested, take a closer look at apoptosis, a cellular process describing programmed cell death.
Nice. You learn something new every day. Let's move on though. Every cell has also what's called a cell membrane, which is formed of a phospholipid bilayer that controls the movement of substances such as ions, protein, glucose, and water in and out of the cell. It's basically got protein channels for the proteins and polar molecules, and other substances like water can just diffuse straight through the membrane.
Mitochondria are where aerobic respiration happens and ATP is made.
So, for those of you wondering what respiration is, it is not, in fact, just breathing, which is a thing a lot of people say. Respiration is actually the chemical process that happens in all living things, and this releases energy. So, in other words, mitochondria are, in fact, the powerhouse of the cell, but do not tell that to your teachers.
And it's where oxygen and glucose react to produce carbon dioxide, water, and energy in the form of ATP, which can be broken down later on to be used in processes such as active transport.
Now that we know a lot about eukaryotic cells, let's see if we can build them up into more complex structures.
If you join lots of cells with similar structures and functions together, you get tissues.
There's 4 basic types of tissue: connective tissue, epithelial tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue.
That seems like a lot.
So connective tissue is the team player. It supports other tissues and binds them together. Epithelial tissue covers our skin and the lining of different tubes around the body, for example, blood vessels and bronchi.
Muscle tissue can then be further divided into striated and smooth muscle. Because the detail never ends in biology, we are full aware of this.
Can you give like an explanation of the difference between striated and smooth for people who don't know?
Yep. So, striated muscle tissue is usually what we think of when someone says muscles, and it is what moves our skeleton voluntarily, and this muscle is attached to bones by tendons.
So, for example, this could include your biceps.
Exactly. And meanwhile, smooth muscle is found in the walls of your arteries, as well as the walls of your digestive tract, i.e., think about your esophagus. And this muscle involuntarily contracts, so we're never thinking to ourselves, I must contract my esophagus. That's not happening.
Returning to the last basic tissue type, which is nerve tissue, it's made up of nerve cells, which are usually called neurons, which are like these long, thin strands which carry electrical impulses and chemical signals to different parts of the body. And they're found in the brain and the spinal cord mainly.
And once you have these different tissues, 2 or more of them can join together to form organs, such as your heart, your muscles, or your kidneys.
And these organs then come together to form 12 organ systems in human beings. And these are, firstly, the respiratory system, which is your lungs, and it helps with gas exchange. You then have the digestive system, which is involved with the breakdown, absorption, assimilation, and excretion of nutrients, which are found in the food that you eat. Then you have the circulatory system, which is about your heart and your blood. That transports nutrients, waste, hormones, oxygen, and carbon dioxide, as well as maintaining pH and temperature around your body. You then have the urinary system, which maintains water and salt concentrations in the blood and removes waste products, such as urea, from the blood to help control pH, or maintain intravascular fluid and salt concentration, detoxify your blood, and excrete liquid waste.
Then you have a more simple system, which is the integumentary system, and that's just a fancy word for talking about anything to do with your skin. And this allows for exterior protection of the body and thermal regulation. Then we move on to the skeletal system, which provides structural support and production of blood cells and protein. Then we have the muscular system, which is really important for our day-to-day, and it allows us to basically move anywhere, and it also gives us heat, because basically when the muscle cells contract, they have to have energy to contract, and they make this energy via respiration, and respiration also releases some heat because it's an exothermic reaction. And then we have the endocrine system, which is everything to do with hormones, and these communicate within the body. So hormones are basically just chemical messengers.
Then we move on to the lymphatic system, which is directly connected to the immune system, and it transfers lymph fluid between tissues and bloodstreams. So it aids the immune response. And lymph fluid usually contains white blood cells. Then there's the nervous system, which consists of neurons, the spinal cord, and the brain, and it controls sensing and processing information, pain responses, and controlling bodily functions. Then there's the reproductive system, which produces gametes, which is sex cells, and sex hormones. So it's involved in reproduction to produce fertile offspring. Then there's the immune system, which consists of immune organs like the thymus, the spleen, the tonsils, the adenoids, and that defends against harmful pathogens that want to infect our body and cause harm.
These organ systems then work within each other and interact with other systems to make a fully functioning organism, like you.
Okay, but what about plants? Those cells aren't the same, or are they?
No, they're not the same, and unlike our cells, they don't have lysosomes.
Okay, is that the only difference?
Nah, they've got other distinct features. Chloroplasts, a vacuole, and a cell wall that's made out of cellulose.
Chloroplasts. That's where photosynthesis occurs, right?
Yeah, photosynthesis is the conversion of light energy into chemical energy, which also requires carbon dioxide and water to function.
And the vacuole is where the plant cell stores waste, food, and water.
Exactly. And finally, we have the cell wall, which is probably the most well known. And this helps the plant cell to keep its structure and also allows the plant cell to be turgid, which basically means when the plant cell takes on a lot of water, rather than bursting, the cell wall allows it to stay turgid and firm.
Wow, that's so interesting. Okay, that was a lot of information all in one go. Feel free to leave any questions in the comments or tell us what you found interesting.
See you next week.